I wasn't in the mood to study. I mean, how could I be when the sun was shining, the breeze was perfect, and my textbooks were staring at me like a death sentence? With midterms around the corner, I knew I should have stayed glued to my desk, but screw that. I grabbed my jacket, shoved my phone into my pocket, and bolted out of the house. A quick walk to clear my head, I told myself. I'd come back refreshed, ready to cram. It was the perfect excuse, right? I didn't have a destination in mind. I just needed to get away from the suffocating mess of notebooks and highlighted pages that had taken over my life. My sneakers hit the pavement with a sense of freedom I hadn't felt in weeks, and I let my feet carry me wherever they wanted. I cut through familiar streets, weaving between parked cars and sidestepping people glued to their phones, the noise of the city a welcome distraction from the chaos in my mind. After a while, the buildings started to change. The clean, modern shops gave way to older, run-down storefronts. I didn't recognize this part of town, but it didn't bother me. The walk was supposed to be a distraction, and this was working. Every block seemed to get quieter, the traffic sounds fading behind me until it felt like I was the only person left in the world. That's when I saw it. It was tucked between two crumbling brick buildings, half hidden in shadow. The window was covered in grime, the glass so cloudy I could barely make out the interior. Above the door, a faded sign hung crookedly, the letters barely legible, "The Curiosity Shop." I stopped in my tracks. The place was ancient, the kind of store that looked like it hadn't had a customer in decades. Yet something about it pulled at me. I had no idea why, but my feet were already turning toward the door, my hand reaching for the handle. A bell above the door jingled as I stepped inside, the sound sharp in the silence. The air was thick with dust, musty and old, like the room hadn't breathed fresh air in years. Shelves lined the walls, cluttered with odd trinkets. Old toys, strange tools, books with cracked leather spines. Everything looked like it had been forgotten, left to rot in this strange little corner of the world. I should have left. I know that now. But something about the place intrigued me. The deeper I went, the darker it became, the single light bulb hanging from the ceiling flickering weakly as though struggling to stay alive. I ran my fingers across the shelves as I walked, feeling the rough edges of worn wood and cold metal beneath my skin. There was something off about this shop. Something unsettling that crawled up my spine the longer I stayed. But instead of turning back, I kept going, deeper into the labyrinth of shelves and strange forgotten items. I don't know what I was looking for. Maybe I just wanted to find something, anything, that would explain why this place seemed to whisper my name the moment I stepped inside. And then I saw it. At the back of the shop, tucked away behind stacks of dusty books, there was a door. Unlike everything else in the store, this door was new. The wood was polished, the knob gleaming in the dim light. It didn't belong here, not in this forgotten relic of a place. My gut twisted with a mix of curiosity and unease, but I couldn't stop myself. I reached for the door, my fingers hovering over the cold metal of the knob. For a split second, I hesitated, that small voice in the back of my mind screaming at me to turn around, to get the hell out of there. But I didn't listen. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. There was no reason to go down there. None at all. And yet I couldn't resist. The air that drifted up from the stairwell was different, colder, like it had been sealed away for a long, long time. I took a step down, then another. My footfalls echoed off the stone walls as I descended, the light from the shop fading behind me until I was swallowed by shadows. The air grew colder with each step, and soon I was shivering, my breath visible in the dim light that barely filtered down from the crack in the door above. At the bottom of the stairs, I found myself in a small room. It was empty except for one thing. In the center of the room was a single mirror. It was massive, framed in ornate silver, its surface impossibly clean compared to the decay of everything around it. The mirror seemed out of place, much like the door, like it had been planted here deliberately. There was something unsettling about it, something that made my skin crawl. But I couldn't look away. As I approached, I realized with a sinking feeling that my reflection wasn't quite right. It wasn't just a trick of the light or the grime clinging to the air. No, it was wrong. The person staring back at me wasn't moving the way I was. She was standing still, her eyes locked on mine, her lips curled into a faint, mocking smile. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I raised my hand, but the reflection stayed still, watching me. And then, slowly, her hand began to lift, not in sync with mine, but deliberately on her own. My heart hammered in my chest as I took a step back, my body trembling with the urge to run, to get as far away from that thing as possible. But my legs wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by the wrongness of it all. Suddenly, the mirror began to ripple, like the surface of a pond disturbed by a stone. My reflection distorted, her face warping and twisting until it was no longer mine. The figure in the mirror grinned wider, her eyes glowing with something dark, something hungry. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. My legs finally obeyed, and I bolted for the stairs, my feet pounding against the cold stone as I scrambled back up into the shop. But when I reached the top and threw the door open, the shop was different. The shelves were empty, the windows boarded up. Dust hung thick in the air, and the weak light bulb overhead flickered and buzzed like it was struggling to stay alive. The door to the street was still there, but it was now covered in rust, the glass cracked and shattered. I stumbled toward it, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. When I pushed the door open, the bell didn't ring. There was only silence, thick and oppressive, like the entire world had gone still. Outside, the street was empty. The buildings were crumbling, abandoned. I had only been in the shop for a few minutes, hadn't I? I stood on the sidewalk, staring out at the street, my heart hammering in my chest. This was wrong. All of it. When I'd walked in, this part of town had been run down, sure, but not abandoned like this. Now, everything looked ancient, as though decades had passed in the few minutes I had spent inside that cursed shop. The buildings that once lined the street had turned to cracked, crumbling skeletons, windows smashed, roofs sagging inward. The air itself felt wrong, thick and oppressive, like it had been trapped here with no one to breathe it for years. I whipped around, expecting the shop behind me to be different too, but it was still there, the same crooked sign, the same dingy windows, just as it had been when I stepped inside. But something was off. The feeling that had tugged me inside was gone, replaced by a cold dread that gnawed at the edges of my mind. I should have just left, run home. But I couldn't move. My legs felt frozen in place, rooted to the cracked pavement beneath me. I glanced down the street, searching for any sign of life, anything that might prove I hadn't just walked into a nightmare. There was nothing. No cars, no people. Just the wind, howling softly between the buildings, carrying with it the faint scent of rot. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. This wasn't possible. It couldn't be. I reached for my phone, desperate for some sense of normalcy, some connection to the world outside this bizarre place. But when I pulled it out of my pocket, the screen was black. No matter how many times I pressed the power button, it wouldn't turn on. The battery had been full when I left the house. I was sure of it. Okay, I whispered to myself, forcing my voice to sound calm even though my mind was screaming. Just get a grip. You walked in. You can walk out. I turned my back on the shop and started walking. My feet felt heavy, as though something was dragging at my ankles with every step, but I forced myself to keep moving. The street stretched out ahead of me, lined with decaying buildings that seemed to go on forever. I was sure this wasn't how I'd gotten here. The layout of the town had changed, twisted in a way that made no sense. After what felt like hours of walking, I finally stopped. My legs were trembling and my breath was coming in short, panicked bursts. I glanced back over my shoulder, expecting to see the shop far behind me, but there it was, just a few steps away. The Curiosity Shop, looking exactly as it had when I'd first seen it. My stomach twisted. No matter how far I walked, I couldn't leave. I was trapped. Panic surged through me. I ran, sprinting as fast as I could, my sneakers slamming against the pavement. My breath came in ragged gasps, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I had to get out. But no matter how fast I ran, no matter how many turns I took, I always ended up right back in front of that damn shop. I collapsed onto the ground, my lungs burning, my vision swimming from exhaustion. The wind picked up again, swirling dust and debris around me as I sat there, panting, staring up at the faded sign. And then the door opened. I hadn't touched it. I hadn't even been near it. But it swung open slowly, creaking on its hinges like a mouth opening wide to swallow me whole. Inside, the dim light flickered again, casting long, distorted shadows across the floor. Something moved inside. It was subtle at first, just a flicker of motion in the corner of my eye. I squinted into the darkness, my body trembling as I strained to make out the shape. At first, it was just a shadow, a vague blur in the periphery of my vision. But then it stepped forward. A figure. Tall, with limbs too long, too thin. Its body was draped in tattered black cloth, its face hidden beneath a hood that seemed to swallow all the light around it. The figure stood just inside the door, still as a statue, but I could feel its eyes on me. Watching. For a moment, neither of us moved. I sat there, frozen in place, my body refusing to obey the desperate commands of my brain to run, to scream, to do anything but stare at the thing in the doorway. Then, slowly it began to move. Its legs bent at awkward angles as it stepped forward, the sound of its feet scraping against the floor sending a chill down my spine. It didn't walk like a person. It didn't move like anything that should exist. I scrambled backward, my hands slipping on the rough pavement as I tried to put as much distance between myself and that thing as possible. But I couldn't look away. Its face, or what should have been its face, was a void, an emptiness that seemed to swallow everything around it. As it drew closer, I felt the air grow colder, the shadows deepening until it was hard to see anything at all. The figure stopped just outside the shop, its body looming over me, casting a long dark shadow that seemed to stretch for miles. And then it spoke. The voice that came from beneath the hood wasn't a voice at all. It was a whisper, a scraping sound like metal against stone, but the words were clear enough to send ice shooting through my veins. You shouldn't have come here. My heart was pounding in my chest so hard I thought it might burst. I tried to speak, to ask what the hell it wanted, but no sound came out. My throat was too tight, my body too paralyzed with fear. The figure tilted its head as though examining me, before taking another step forward. Its fingers, long and skeletal, reached out, hovering just above my skin. The cold radiating from them was unbearable, like they were draining the warmth from the very air around us. You've seen what you shouldn't see, it hissed, its voice like a gust of icy wind. And now you're one of us. I couldn't move. My body felt like it was made of lead, pinned to the ground by an invisible weight. The figure's hand drew closer, closer, until it was inches from my face. Suddenly, a blinding light flashed across the street, cutting through the darkness like a knife. The figure recoiled, its body twisting unnaturally as it backed away into the shadows. I blinked, disoriented, as a car horn blared in the distance, the sound sharp and jarring in the eerie silence. When my vision cleared, the figure was gone. I was alone on the street again, the curiosity shop standing innocently behind me, its door closed as if it had never opened at all. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I fumbled for it with shaking hands, my heart still hammering in my chest. The screen lit up with a single notification. Battery 1%. Before I could react, the phone died, plunging me back into silence.